The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Donalds, is now recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Witnesses, thanks for being here. I have no idea what that analogy or symbol or whatever that was, even that doesn't make any sense at all. So I'm clueless on that. A couple of things that have already come up in this hearing about taxes. Listen, the top 20% pay 70% of all federal income taxes in this country. Actually, under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, middle-income Americans are paying less in federal income taxes. That's the data, that's the facts. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle love saying how the Tax Cut and Jobs Act cost us $2 trillion. Well, that's a lie, because even last year, $900 billion came in over on top of CBO's estimate of tax receipts from Tax Cut and Jobs Act. So I think it's time that we start putting to rest the ridiculous political arguments that typically come from the other side of the aisle. I do want to focus in on the concept of actual national default, because this is actually an important one. We are spending far more money than we have. We're $32 trillion in debt. Most people know the major high point data pieces. But when it comes to the debt ceiling, it is actually nebulous for the American people what default actually means. The press loves saying it. Members on Capitol Hill love saying it. But what are we actually talking about? So, and you guys can tag team this. It's up to you. I don't really care who answers. But I think it's important that we get to brass tacks. If we cross the debt ceiling now in January 1 of 25, if we come to that date and there is no authorization from Congress to raise the debt ceiling, what does that actually mean? Does that mean that our economy cascades? Does that mean that we have no ability to borrow additional money to pay for the other obligations or the other spending priorities that Congress has authorized? Does that mean that interest on the debt is no longer paid?
So I think some of that to determine what it would actually look like still rests with Treasury. But if you're constrained by the debt limit, you can only engage in spending that's contractually obligated to the extent that money is coming in on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, so I want to freeze you on that one, because this is important. So if you're past the debt limit without raising the statutory cap on how much money you can borrow, then Treasury is constrained to only spending money on the things that the federal government is contractually obligated to pay as long as they have dollars to pay it. Is that correct?
That's right. They only have the money that's coming in to make payments.
Okay. Secondarily, does Treasury have the ability to make interest and/or principal payments on existing debt obligations as long as they have the cash to do so?
We think that they do, and we think they were considering that in 2011 based on public records.
Okay. Third question to follow up. If there is a tranche of Treasury bonds underneath the statutory cap, does Treasury have the ability to refinance said bonds in the bond market, even though Congress has not elevated the statutory cap?
We believe Treasury can roll over existing debt.
So Treasury can roll over existing debt. They can make payments on existing debt. They can make payments on other contractually obligated operations as long as they have cash to do so. And that are the broad three parameters of what a quote-unquote default is in the United States. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay. So this is important. I'm not trying to play politics. I'm trying to understand exactly what we're talking about, because we're going to come to the debt ceiling again. And it's important for the American people to understand exactly what happens and what doesn't happen if Congress does not, for whatever the reasons are, not engage in raising the debt ceiling. So I used to work in finance. If a company that I was financing cut operations because they could no longer fund those operations, but they continued to make the payments on the money that I lent them, is that a default on their debt obligations?
I couldn't answer that. I would only say that we may not be able to make all payments under.
So let me answer it for you. As a former banker, if the company had to cease other operations, but they still paid me my loan payments, that is not a default on the debt that they've extended. Now, I do recognize that if Congress does not have the ability to raise, or the government doesn't have the ability to continue to borrow money to fund all the operations of government, that there are some contracts that would not be paid in that time period of not raising the debt ceiling. Here's my final question to you. How is that different from a shutdown scenario when the federal government doesn't pass budget appropriations?
You want to answer it, or?
The gentleman's time has expired. Can the witness answer for the record, please?
Yeah, we can get that for that.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, for the record.
Sorry, the gentleman's time has expired. All right, the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Ogles, is now recognized, and he has the prerogative to ask that same question for his colleague from Florida.
I yield so you can answer the question. We're on the clock.
I mean, I think they're slightly different in the shutdown means there's been a lapse in appropriations, federal agencies. There are certain things they can do. There are certain things that they can't do because they don't have the authorization without running into the Anti-Deficiency Act. That's a little different from the scenario of what would happen if Treasury didn't have the funds to make the payments, whether it's to bondholders, interest and principal, or to contracts, other obligations that Treasury has. So they're slightly different.
I'd also say with a shutdown, Congress and policymakers in general are controlling exactly what is being funded and what is not. With a debt limit, I think it's uncertain, and that's probably in the hands of Treasury and just subject to the kind of flow of the federal budget.
And I think to close on my colleague's point, the language used and the rhetoric used by Treasury to intimidate American citizens in believing that we are in more dire circumstances than we were is unacceptable.